Melinda Doles,
Yes.
Louise Hines,
Here.
Simi Petnaik,
Here.
Pat Driscoll is absent. Sharon Van Leer is absent. Katie Schwartz,
Here.
Tracy Burnett.
Here. All right, so tonight we are going to have a hearing process. 2 head coaches have requested a hearing before the School Board of Independent School District 833 to dispute the termination of their coaching contract for the remainder of the spring season, including the decision not to pay the full amount of the stipend for the spring season. The school board has consolidated the 2 hearing requests and is using an online platform to conduct the hearing. The district will begin by making a brief opening statement and then presenting the reasons for terminating the coaching contracts for the remainder of the spring season and not paying a portion of the stipend for the spring season. The 2 head coaches who have requested a hearing will then have an opportunity to address the school board and to present information in support of their position that the school board should not terminate their contracts and should pay the full amount of the stipend. After the coaches present their position, the district may present rebuttal evidence, but it is not required to do so. Not including opening statements, the district and the 2 coaches will each have a total of 30 minutes to present their positions. Please refrain from making cumulative or redundant statements. Also, please keep in mind that this is an informal proceeding. There will be no cross-examination and the formal rules of evidence do not apply. This is simply an opportunity for the board to hear directly from the coaches. The district has submitted exhibits 1 through 11 for presentation at the hearing. The coaches have also presented 2 documents. At the conclusion of the hearing, each side will have an opportunity to make a very short closing argument, which should not exceed 5 minutes, and to submit proposed findings and conclusions. This hearing is open to the public. Members of the public may listen but are not permitted to comment or participate. The school board will record the hearing. The school board will issue a written decision. The decision may be made immediately after the hearing. The board may make a decision by moving to adopt the proposed findings and conclusions that have been submitted by either party. The school board will uphold, the school board may, I'm sorry, I don't know which word to use. There's both of them, will or may. I probably need to ask Mick. Or is it irrelevant? I don't know. The school board may uphold the termination of the coaching contracts as it sees fit for any reason which it finds to be true based on competent evidence submitted at the hearing. The school board's decision is final. At this time, well, actually, you know what? Sorry, I was told to read this prior, but first of all, we need to have 3.0, which is approval of our agenda. So I will entertain a motion to approve our agenda. Please make sure to state your name.
Louise Hines, so moved.
Schwartz, second.
All right, move by Louise and second by Katie. Roll call vote.
Melinda Doles,
Yes.
Louise Hines,
Yes.
Simi Petnaik,
Yes.
Pat Driscoll is absent. Sharon Van Leer is absent. Katie Schwartz. Katie Schwartz
Yes.
and Tracy Burnett.
Yes, thank you. So at this time, I would ask the district to proceed with an opening statement. The coaches will then make their opening statement. After the coaches conclude their opening statement, the district will then begin its presentation of the case. Please keep opening statements to less than 5 minutes. So 4.0 is the hearing on termination of coaching contracts. And I guess I'm not sure if I'm turning it over to Kevin, Director of Human Services, or Mick.
You are turning it over to me. Thank you,
All right.
Madam
Thanks.
Chair. Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Mick Woltzberger, and I'm one of the attorneys who represents the school board of Independent School District number 833. And as you indicated, the purpose of the meeting really here is to conduct an informal hearing or an opportunity for the coaches to speak directly to the board about the termination of their extracurricular coaching contracts. It's analogous to a situation where the board non-renews a contract and a coaching contract, and then the coach gets to come in and talk to the board, and we present reasons as well. And I represent the board, but I still present the reasons to the board. So it's a similar format to that, just slightly different. Scott Leonard entered into a contract to serve as the varsity head coach of the girls lacrosse team for Park High School for the spring season of the 1920 school year. And Greg Rinzel entered into a contract to serve as the varsity head coach of the boys lacrosse team for that same season. The district terminated the contracts of all high school coaches for cause during the season, right at the start of it. And specifically, the cause was that the Minnesota State High School League canceled the season because of the COVID-19 global pandemic. The cancellation of the season frustrated the purpose of the contracts and made it impossible for the coaches, including Mr. Leonard and Mr. Rinzel, to perform their regular coaching duties. In accordance with the plain language of the coaching contracts that they signed, the district reduced pro rata the amount of the coaching stipend that all coaches received for activities that they couldn't perform. Mr. Leonard and Mr. Rinzel each received 1/3 of the regular stipend, despite the fact that the season was canceled after only 1 week in. Around the same time, the district furloughed over 200 other employees. The administration concluded that it would be untenable to pay coaches for work they did not and could not perform, while furloughing over 200 other employees who were counting on their paychecks just as much, if not more. Additionally, paying head coaches their full stipend would cost the district approximately $172,000 in addition to the 1/3 or $86,000 it had already paid the coaches. The district could hire 2 teachers or perhaps more correctly, lay off 2 fewer teachers for that amount of money. It's also important to understand the district did not realize a windfall from terminating coaching contracts. The district returned approximately $148,000 in activity fees to families. Didn't keep that money. So it returned the $148,000 and it already paid $86,000 out to the head coaches. There are a few laws I want to just briefly address with the board so you're familiar with them as we go forward. First, the law recognizes a couple of exceptions that relieve a party from a contract, a binding contract, even when it doesn't have language like we have here that allows you to terminate for cause. And specifically, the law says that either party can be relieved from the contract if the purpose of the contract is frustrated, the purpose is frustrated through no fault of the party that's trying to be relieved of its obligations. And the classic case example that we have is Alabama Football Inc. versus Wright. And in that case, you had an individual athlete whose last name was Wright, who signed a 3-year contract to play football for the World Football League, and he was going to play for the Alabama team. Well, right after signing that contract for this great 3-year deal of a lifetime, the World Football League collapsed and ceased to exist. And the court held that under those facts, the purpose of the contract was completely frustrated. And as a result, the Alabama football team did not have to pay Wright under that contract. A similar doctrine is recognized in Minnesota as well, known as the Doctrine of Impossibility, meaning if it's impossible for either party to perform under the contract through no fault of its own, the other party then is relieved. Both of those doctrines apply perfectly here. The principal purpose of the contract was to have coaches provide coaching services during the State High School League spring season. They couldn't do that. It was impossible for them to do that, and the purpose of the contract was frustrated. Having a spring season was not only a basic assumption on which the contract was based, it was the complete basis for that particular contract. I also want to briefly talk about this hearing because sometimes there are misunderstandings about whether there's a right to a hearing or not. It used to be at one time, and there's still a statute in the books that goes back and has no application, where coaches had a right to a hearing if they were terminated mid-season for cause. That statute no longer applies because coaches are no longer required to hold a coaching license, separate from other licenses that they might have. And the statute that says that they're not required to do that is Minnesota Statute 122A.33. And there's a case out of the Roseville School District called Bucher, B-U-E-C-H-E-R versus ISD 623 Roseville, where the Court of Appeals concluded, again, that statute no longer applies and there's no longer a right to a hearing. So why are we having a hearing tonight? Well, there is some basic level of due process that we want to accord, and we want to make sure that we're modeling similar to what we do with non-renewal of coaches. And so this is really just an opportunity for the coaches to address you as individual board members directly about concerns that they might have. Lastly, I want to just briefly talk about what I'm going to refer to as the balance of harms here. You know, in cases like this, it can be really easy to say, what's the big deal? Why don't we just pay these two coaches their full amount of their stipend? You know, they made the effort, they came forward with a hearing. And besides, on top of that, we know that all coaches work really hard. They work a lot of hours before the season. They work hours during the season. They work hours after the season. And so you're basically just paying them for all the work they did outside the season anyway, instead of for the work during the season. So what's the harm in that? Well, there would be significant harm. Aside from the fact that it carries a price tag of about $172,000 to just pay the other head coaches. Once you've done that and you've broken into that precedent, now you're going to have to also pay all of the activities or the other activity folks, advisors and directors as well. So your price tag is just ballooned beyond that. Additionally, the notion of paying coaches for work that they do outside of their season is a very dangerous and slippery slope. Number one, every time you fire a coach for misconduct, you're not going to be able to stop paying because they're going to come back and say, wait a minute, I don't actually get paid for what I do during the season. I get paid for what I do outside the season. Number two, let's say you have a coach who quits right before the season. They're going to say, I'm entitled to be paid my full stipend because the bulk of the work I do is before the season, as evidenced by the fact that you had a hearing and you gave these other coaches their full pay, even though they never had a season. So they're going to claim that they have the right to it. More significantly, and I think people often lose sight of this, if you pay coaches with the notion that you're paying them for work outside of the season, you are arguably violating the Minnesota State High School League rules. The league has very stringent rules and restrictions on what coaches can do out of season. It has specific exceptions, summer waivers, for example. But when you read the State High School League bylaws, they specifically state when you're acting out of season, and even during the summer waiver period, which is a specific grant of authority to do things during the summer, the coach is, quote, not performing a school function. The school, quote, has no responsibility. The coach is acting as a, quote, independent contractor and not an official capacity. And finally, the State High School League says the coach is not representing the school. If you say you're paying coaches for their work outside of school or outside the season, you're going against those rules and you run significant risk of penalty from the league. At the conclusion of the hearing, and we'll present evidence through Mr. Witherspoon, I'll ask him questions back and forth. We're going to be asking the board to adopt the proposed findings and conclusions that I submitted to you. And I also submitted those to the two coaches by email this afternoon as well, right after I submitted them to the board. And those proposed findings and conclusions and proposed decision would uphold the termination of the coaching contracts and the pro rata decrease in the stipend that was paid to them. Thank you. And now, Madam Chair, the coaches would have an opportunity to make an opening statement if they would like to do so.
So, would one or the other of the coaches present, Greg or Scott, like to speak at this time?
I'll give a quick opening. In regards to the district saying we should only be paid for our time in season, I'm going to be arguing that the way that we are hired as coaches is completely contrary to the district's position. I'll present that as part of my findings. The one thing I want to be careful of, it says that I never asked for my full contract. I understand 2.5 months of our season were wiped out. I don't expect 100% in my emails to the board over the last few weeks. I have given examples of the other 16, 17 schools around us who are doing that. I'm not saying I expect that. I just am wondering how we came up with 33% when everyone else is 60 to 100%. So I'll be talking about that as well. Once again, I don't expect 100%. I'm just looking for more information on how 33 came about. So that's it for my opening statement. Now I'll present more when the time is right if Greg has anything to say.
I'd love to have the opportunity. My video come through. Can everyone? Not sure if it's working now. I see Katie trying to nod her head. So, well, thank you for allowing us the opportunity to kind of give our version of what occurred. I'm not going to give you anything. The law is the law. I'm aware of contracts, but there's also what the board can do is in contracts, and there's what the board should do. And those are two distinctly different things. One thing I will talk about really briefly before we get into this is my heartburn came from the fact that I received a letter in the mail stating my contract was terminated. There was zero communications through the district human services other than I sent my contract in. I believe an email went out to some coaches. I wasn't on that email list. I never received any correspondence. So the only thing I received was a termination letter. And in my position, in my real job where I make my money every year, to treat employees with a form letter and nothing else, not a meeting, not a discussion, not a, hey, guys, we're all in a bind here. Let's have a quick Zoom meeting to discuss our the information we have and how the season's going to move forward. There's absolutely no communication, which in my opinion, as a coach, is unacceptable. I have communications with my parents, my players on a regular basis, as I would believe that the school district should also have with the coaching staff. So my concern is the lack of communication wholeheartedly, and the fact that, yes, there are things you can do as a school board, but there's also things that you possibly should do based upon what's right. And those aren't always, they're sometimes in conflict, the law versus what's right and you can do. I would also quickly state that Scott will present the information relative to everybody else in the conference paid their head coaches full stipends, and if the attorney's correct in his analysis, I'm sure all the other districts have a different analysis from their attorneys stating why they should pay the coaches. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. So with that, Mr. Witherspoon or Dr. Witherspoon, I'd ask you to turn your microphone on. I'm going to proceed to ask you some questions in a more traditional question and answer type format. Certainly, the coaches are not obligated to utilize that format, but I thought I would just with you, Dr. Witherspoon, so we'd have it kind of laid out in the traditional form. So, Dr. Witherspoon, first of all, what position do you hold with the district?
I'm the Director of Human Resources.
And can you give just a brief overview of what you do as the Director of HR?
Sure. Yes. So I'm responsible for all facets of human resources throughout the school district. Some of those facets, at least in this circumstance, would be once decisions are made by district administration, it is my responsibility to execute. And that would include terminating contracts or terminating employees too.
And did the district terminate the coaching contracts of all coaches for the spring season 2020?
Yes.
And what role, if any, did you have in that?
Sure. So with consultation with the superintendent and other district level administrators, the decision was made to release our coaches or terminate the coaching contracts and pay 1/3 of their salary, 1/3 of the stipend, I'm sorry. And my role is to then execute the actual termination of the contracts.
let's look at Exhibit 1 that was submitted. Can you tell us what Exhibit 1 is? For School District Exhibit 1, which is SD, stands for School District, obviously. So School District Exhibit 1, can you tell us what that is?
Sure, and just bear with me. I'm looking at two screens here. So it is a cancellation of it's a document from the Minnesota State High School League with cancellation of the remainder of the 2019-20 season.
And so were all spring athletics canceled as of that date?
Yes, that's correct.
And now let's look at Exhibit 2. What is Exhibit 2?
Exhibit 2 is Minnesota State High School League spring sports and activities participation limits.
And what information generally does this provide to school districts?
Yep, it provides information about what coaches may or may not do. For instance, it says coaches may not have in-person contact with participants, require or suggest groups of participants to gather, conduct tryouts or provide evaluations or feedback on participants' performance. But it does allow for coaches to connect with participants via electronic communication, email, social media, and such. Provide optional individual workouts or connect with and support participants who are challenged by the changes with COVID-19.
So basically, to summarize it, it's not permitting any kind of traditional coaching, holding practices, things like that, but allowing still for some connection with kids, recognizing that that's good for kids, especially during a pandemic.
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay. Let's look at Exhibit 3. What's Exhibit 3?
Exhibit 3 is the coaching contract for Scott Leonard, the extracurricular contract for Scott Leonard for lacrosse girls varsity head coach at Park High School.
Okay. And the second numbered paragraph states it's not subject to a statute, section 122A.58, unless made specifically applicable by that. What's your understanding of whether that statute applies here?
It's my understanding that it does not apply.
And why not?
Coaches no longer are required to hold a coaching license, and therefore the statute doesn't apply.
The third numbered paragraph states that the contract may be terminated for cause during the contract year, and in such event, the compensation will be reduced pro rata for any part of the activity not performed. In the spring of 2020, did the district terminate coaching contracts for cause and reduce the compensation pro rata?
Yes.
And we'll come back to that in just a sec. What is Exhibit 4?
All right, here. Exhibit 4 is the extracurricular contract for Greg Rinzel, boys lacrosse varsity head coach at Park High School.
And does that have the same paragraph number 3, same language in that paragraph that the other contract had?
It does.
And in fact, aside from the dollar amounts and the signatures, the text of the paragraphs 1 through 7 are the same, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Let's turn to Exhibit 5. What is Exhibit 5?
Exhibit 5 is an email that was sent on Monday, May 11th, 2020 from the HR email, and it was addressed to coaches, directors, and advisors.
And why did you send that to coaches, directors, and advisors?
To notify them that they would receive 1/3 of their contract.
And the email begins by stating that the district had made the difficult decision to furlough over 200 employees. What impact, if any, did that difficult decision have on the district's decision to terminate coaches mid-season and give them only 1/3 of their regular stipend?
I'm sorry, Mick, you were cutting out, so I'm going to cut off my video to see if it's my computer.
Okay.
Can you all still hear me?
I can hear you. So my question
Can you hear me,
was,
Mick?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, could you repeat the question? You were cutting in and out, but I think it's better now.
Yep, my question is, the email begins by stating that the district made the difficult decision to furlough over 200 employees. And I wanted to know what impact, if any, did that difficult decision have on your later decision then to terminate coaches mid-season and give them just 1/3 of their stipend?
Yeah, The idea would be that we could not justify paying coaches their full stipend for not doing the work while laying off over 200 employees of the district.
I'd ask you to turn now to Exhibit 6. What is Exhibit 6?
Exhibit 6 is a letter that is addressed to, let's see here, May 15th, 2020 letter addressed to Scott Leonard.
And why did you send this letter to, first of all, you sent it, you signed it?
That's correct.
And why did you send it to Mr. Leonard?
To provide formal notice that the district was terminating Mr. Leonard's contract and reducing the stipend accordingly.
And what is Exhibit 7?
Exhibit 7 is the same letter dated May 15th, 2020 addressed to Gregory Renzel.
And so just to be clear, the text of the two letters is the same, correct?
That is correct. It was notice to terminate the coaching contract and reducing the stipend amount.
And did the district terminate Mr. Leonard's and Mr. Renzel's contracts for cause?
Yes.
And specifically, what was the cause for terminating the contracts?
Sure. The Minnesota High School League canceled the spring season, and as a result, the purpose of the contracts was frustrated, and it was impossible for the coaches to perform their duties. Given that the district had furloughed over 200 employees without pay because they could not perform work, the district concluded that it would be inappropriate to pay coaches who did not perform their position. Additionally, based on advice from the school board's attorney, the administration was aware that the public purpose doctrine and the gift law generally prohibit a school district from giving money to individuals for services that are not performed.
And I don't want you to disclose any of the communications that I've had with administration directly, but to the best of your understanding, what is the public purpose doctrine?
Sure. Case law and attorney general opinions talking about public entities, including school districts, and the purpose for how they spend public money. They can only spend money for a public purpose and not for a private purpose.
And so what's your understanding, Dr. Witherspoon, of how the public purpose doctrine would apply in this particular case?
Sure. Paying individuals for work they didn't perform and cannot perform because the season was canceled, primarily for a private purpose and the private benefit of those individuals. It would be primarily for a private purpose and the private benefit of those individuals, meaning the coaches.
Yeah. And can school districts just give gifts or donations to individuals?
No, the district cannot do that.
Now, the governor's emergency executive orders do contain some exceptions allowing school districts to pay for some employees who were unable to perform their regular duties. Did any of the executive orders, to your knowledge, authorize districts to pay coaches for work they didn't perform?
Nope, they did not.
Now, if you got the public purpose doctrine and the gift law that prohibits paying people for work they didn't do, how did the district justify giving even a third of the stipend to the coaches in this case?
Sure. The district made some decisions regarding to acknowledge the fact that we know that coaches do some planning before the season starts. There was some communication with student athletes. And then a portion of coaches, including the two coaches here tonight, Mr. Leonard and Mr. Renzel, had, I believe, 1 week of coaching in the spring season.
I want to direct your attention to the middle of, it's both Exhibit 6 and 7, that middle paragraph. And the middle of the second paragraph refers to the governor's executive orders and states that the Minnesota Department of Education has stated that school districts may make budget-based staffing decisions, such as layoffs and terminations, where a dedicated funding stream for the position does not exist. Just in your words, what is a dedicated funding stream?
A dedicating funding stream would be money that federal or state governments provide that's devoted to a specific purpose. I think that the best example would be, or an example would be, special education funds are devoted to providing special education services.
Does a dedicated funding stream exist for coaching positions?
No, it does not.
A dedicated funding stream is different than the fact that we take money out of the budget to pay for coaches, right?
That's right.
How does the district pay for coaching positions generally?
Partly from unassigned funds in the general fund, but mostly from activities fees.
And what did the district do with the activity fees that collected for the spring 2020 season?
The district refunded or returned the fees.
And what impact did that returning of those activity fees have on the decision to terminate coaching contracts?
Well, it was a factor because the school district would lose funding source, and have to pay coaches for seasons that did not exist.
Aside from coaches, can you provide examples of other positions that don't have dedicated funding streams?
Sure, I think two great examples would be our community ed and food service. So like extracurricular activities, they are primarily fee-based.
And were many of those positions laid off without pay?
Yes, over 200 employees.
From your perspective, when the State High School League canceled the season, was the purpose of the contract frustrated?
Yes,
Was it possible for the coaches to perform their regular coaching duties once the season was canceled?
it was not.
Now, looking at the letter in Exhibits 6 and 7, at the bottom of the letter, it indicates that the coaches could request a hearing. Did every head coach in the district get the same letter?
Yes, every head coach got the same letter.
And you've got, is it roughly 43 head coaches? Am I right on that?
That's accurate.
And of those 43, how many have requested and decided to go forward with the hearing?
Initially, there were 3 coaches that were interested in having a hearing, and now there's Mr. Leonard and Mr. Renzel.
Can you turn to Exhibit 8 for me, please? Just tell me what Exhibits 8 and 9 are, actually, just real quick.
Sure. Exhibits 8 and 9 are Mr. Leonard and Mr. Renzel's request for a hearing.
And what is Exhibit 10? Just so we have that into the recorded record.
Sure. Exhibit 10 is notification of a date and time for the hearing for Mr. Leonard.
And Exhibit 11?
Is a notice of and date and time of hearing for Mr. Renzel.
Did you believe it would be fair to pay Mr. Leonard and Mr. Renzel, but not pay other head coaches whose contracts were terminated mid-season?
It would not be fair to do that.
Now, was I right when I said in my opening statement that the cost to pay all head coaches 1/3 of their stipend was $86,000?
That's accurate. It's approximately $86,000.
So if the district paid the full stipend to all coaches, that would be another $172,000 if my math is correct. Is that about right?
It's about right, correct.
And what was the total amount of the activity fees the district refunded to families in the spring of 2020?
Approximately $148,000.
Now, the coaches, Mr. Leonard here and Mr. Renzel, seem to be arguing that they should be paid because other school districts in the state paid their coaches. How would you respond to that argument?
Some districts have paid a portion. Some districts had paid all of it, but many districts, only paid a portion, just like District 833.
And I want the board to know that too, based on my firm representing half the districts in the state. While the examples locally, there were more that did. There were many, many, many school districts that only paid a third of the contracts. Dr. Witherspoon, would you advise the board to violate the public purpose doctrine and gift law just because other districts might not have been aware of those laws?
No, that would not be my recommendation.
Putting aside the law, do you know if your district, District 833, is in the same financial position as other school districts?
I'm sorry, Mick, I don't know if it's my computer or not, but you cut out a little bit.
Yep. Maybe I'll try to get closer and see if that helps. I was saying, putting aside...
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Evan, can you hear me?
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
Dr. Jacobus, can you tell me if you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Dr. Witherspoon, can you hear me now? Technology is great when it works and not so much when it doesn't.
Sorry, I'm having difficulty here. I'm going to quick try to log out and log back in.
Okay. We'll wait.
Do you want me to address that question on financial. Vicky, the question on other districts, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead. Dr. Jacobus, do you know whether your district's in the same financial position as other districts?
I do know that we are in a much bleaker financial district than most districts in the metro area and around the state. Fund balances, the average fund balance around the state now is over 20%. We now, at our last budget update, our fund balance for unassigned will be about 1.4%. So we really have no fund balance compared to most of the districts in the metro area. Part of it has been the years of accelerated expenses and costs. Part of it has been to maintain programs that we've had and accelerating costs in different areas. But we are in very difficult times. We are anticipating a $10 million reduction for next year. So we're not in the same situation as most of our colleague districts.
All right, Dr. Witherspoon, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So there's also, it seems to be an argument that these coaches should be paid the entire stipend because head coaches are expected to stay connected to the community and do work outside of the season. How do you respond to that? First of all, is it a requirement that coaches do that?
It's not a requirement, and I do know that coaches often do, but they make the choice to do that on their own.
And that's something that many coaches do, and perhaps even an expectation to some level to maintain some level of connection, but that's not what they're paid for, correct?
Correct.
Now, did you review information from Activities Director Philip Kummel? And I apologize, I don't know him if I'm mispronouncing his name, but his communications to coaches at Park High School about distance coaching after the season was canceled?
It's Phil Kimmel, just for the record, and yes, I did.
And what did Mr. Kimmel repeatedly tell the coaches in terms of whether it was optional or mandatory?
In his communications, he repeatedly told them the distance coaching was optional.
Now, bottom line, did Mr. Leonard and Mr. Rinzel provide anywhere close to the full amount of coaching services they would have provided if the season was not canceled?
No, they did not.
And when does the bulk of coaching work happen?
During the season itself.
What concern would you have if the school board decided to overturn the administration and pay all head coaches despite the fact that the season was canceled?
Several things. I think one would be the public purpose doctrine, the gift law. I think it's important to talk about the financial impact that it would have on the district, as well as the unfairness to over 200 employees who were furloughed and did not get paid at all.
Thank you. At this time, I would ask the board chair to accept the district's exhibits into the record, and that would conclude the district's initial presentation. The coaches would then have an opportunity to present their views to the board, and I may have some rebuttal when they're done, but at this time, that completes our initial presentation.
All right, thank you. So, who would like to speak first?
I can go if you want, Craig. I'm going to start out. I apologize. My camera wasn't on the last time I spoke. In my communication with Dr. Jacobus, he explained to me that he used to be a coach and that what I do in the off season is volunteer work. I'm not sure when the last time Dr. Jacobus coached. I know when I was an athlete back in the 90s, our coaches were not allowed to coach us during summer leagues and things like that. Our coaches had to sit up in the balcony at South St. Paul High School and couldn't talk to us. I'll show you here that has changed. The Minnesota State High School League has added a summer waiver period where coaches coach. It is an expectation at summer leagues when your high school team shows up that there is a coach there. So if an official needs to address an issue on the field, hey, coach, can you please tell number 15 to keep her stick down? A coach needs to be there. That's part of summer league coaching in today's athletics. In my communications, in my exhibits, I provided 2 interview questions that were asked of me and they're asked of all District 833 coaches. Question number 7 says, can you give us an example of how you worked with booster clubs and youth associations in the past, or how do you plan to work with them if hired for this position? Question number 9, what off-season activities would you encourage your players to participate in, and what involvement would you have in these off-season activities? I am very confident that if I had said, I'm not working with a booster club, I am not going to go work with CGAA or WAA when I was hired, that they would have checked me right out. I wouldn't have got hired in the position. I have to say, this is what I'm going to do. Same thing with the off-season activity. I said, if I came to that interview and said, I'll show up March 30th, start first day of practice, and then walk out June 15th when our team's eliminated from playoffs, once again, the people in that committee would not have hired me. Mr. Kimmel did say it is optional for us to do distance coaching, but Mr. Kimmel has also told me that if I were just a March 30th to June 15th coach, I would not last in my position. After my 2 interview questions, I have primary job functions. There's 16 of them. And as I look at this list, they seem to me to kind of go down in rank of importance, 16 being other duties as assigned. Mr. Witherspoon just said that it's optional to work with the community or booster clubs. Number 4 on this list says promote a favorable image of the school district, encourage community partnerships that enhance district programs and services. To me, that's telling me I need to work with CGAA youth lacrosse program. Number 6, in my job description, primary function, develop and coordinate off-season activities. So the district's saying I have to be a volunteer in the summer, but my job description is telling me you must develop and coordinate off-season activities. Number 8, review game procedures, game schedules, and develop a practice schedule before the start of the season. Number 8, that says before the start of the season, but I'm only contracted at the start of the season. Once again, they contradict each other. As far as game schedules, I have to start working on game schedules September, October. We have a 13-game schedule as a Minnesota State High School lacrosse team. 9 of those are pre-assigned by our conference, so I don't have to schedule those. But I'm required to come up with 4 non-conference games. If I wait till March 30th to start calling other high schools, hey, Coach Hoffman at Roseville, would you, or wherever, can I come play you? She's going to tell me, I'm sorry, we booked our schedule back in the fall. I don't have room for you. So then the school district, or Mr. Kimmel's going to be getting phone calls from my parents going, how come our players only play 9 games and everybody else in our conference is playing 13 games? Right? Once again, if I wait till the start of the season to do that, there's going to be a big issue. I also have to schedule buses before the season starts. The district requires at least a 2-week minimum to schedule a bus. So if I wait till my first day and start scheduling buses, the first 2 weeks of our season, moms and dads are not going to be happy when they have to drive 40 girls from Cottage Grove, Minnesota up to Forest Lake for a game, or to Stillwater for SEC scrimmages, right? These are all things that take place. I would, in the presentation from the district, it says the vast majority of the work takes place during the season. I would actually argue the opposite of that. I would say my work, 66 to 75% of my job is done June 15th until March 30th. Once again, times have changed. I know when I was an athlete, it was different. These are now expectations. If I'm not out there in the summertime, my parents are going to wonder how come Park High School lacrosse is falling behind times. And then I move on to the 5 domains of coaching, which I have attached. This is how I'm evaluated. Mr. Kimmel sits down with me at the end of every season and addresses where he feels I fall in this list. Domain 1, E is the implementation of effective off-season training program. It says does not encourage off-season training is unsatisfactory. Encourages off-season training but has no role is basic. So in order for me to be proficient, I must implement effective off-season training programs. That's just to be proficient. I must be a part of it. If we go to domain 4, 4C and D deal with my relationships with both my booster club and community involvement with things like CGA that I speak of. Once again, if I don't do these things, chances of me being around are not very good. I maybe should hold this till rebuttal time. Going back to the actual termination, I'm still trying to figure out why I list 7 other SEC schools and 9 other Metro schools that we compete against in their non-conference games, and not one of them has terminated their head coaches. I'm in contact with these people. These are my friends. And so I'm still trying to figure out why our district chose to terminate them or not terminate them, and we were chosen to be terminated. I've given the numbers that of the 9 East Metro schools and the 7 in our conference, 15 of those schools are paying their coaches 100% of their stipend. Once again, I'm not saying I deserve the 100%. One high school, Henry Sibley, is paying 60%. So once again, it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, I'll let you go.
Thank you.
All right. One question I have, when it came to this decision of making 33%, I'm curious as to how much input the 3 high schools activity directors had involved before the decision was made. We've all the spring coaches have had conversations with our activities directors, and they said the conversations I've had with the other coaches who've had it with their ADs is there's a difference between a head coach and an assistant coach. They acknowledge that our jobs are 2 completely different things. So I'm just curious if any of the school board members, maybe I would encourage you to reach out before you make a decision on this and ask Mr. Kimmel, Mrs. Palatichuk, or Mr. Wooten their thoughts on if 33% is a fair number for the amount of work that we put in. I come back to this gift law violation, and why aren't these other 16 schools, why aren't people investigating their violations of this gift law? It's still, why are we the only ones? The devoted revenue stream, I keep coming back to that. I have about 50 players in my program. They bring in approximately $8,500 of that in a season. So that money was returned to the parents. In our program, over $6,000 of our expenses come out to busing and referees, which the school district did not have to pay out this year. That leaves $2,500 that's going back to the district from that $8,500 fee. Myself and my 3 assistant coaches, our coaching contracts probably add up to about $13,000. So that unassigned devoted revenue stream, it's in the budget. To me, it's in the athletic department's budget. Mr. Kimmel gets a set budget at the beginning of the year for park coaches, and he assigns contracts based on that. That money is in the budget. My next piece on this, in my termination letter, it says that I can be rehired at some point for subsequent seasons. I'm just curious, when will that be as we go into the future here? Because as of right now, the next season has already started. The next season started yesterday on June 15th. Today, our Park Girls soccer program, I'm an assistant coach of that. They have practices today. I've seen basketball starting next week. I know hockey started this week. Our fall and winter coaches are still hired right now, and they are coaching our athletes. Spring coaches in 833 have all been terminated. Who is looking out for the spring athletes? Why are we only worried about the fall and winter athletes at this time? At some point, I've had I would like to know when I'm going to be rehired, if I'm going to be rehired. And then if I am rehired and I start working here in the next 2 months with my players, what's going to stop the district if this COVID comes back next March and my season's terminated again? Am I going to lose all that work that I put in as far as pay again? I don't see an end to this if I keep working my butt off in the summertime, my players, and then March 15th, March 30th, I get a letter saying you're terminated. Right? We spend hours on the turf with those girls. Coach Renzel does with his. I had a senior reach out to me yesterday saying, Coach Leonard, there's a city field that has nets up at West Straw and Cottage Grove. Can we go practice up there? I told her, yeah, you guys can go up there. I just can't go with you because I've been terminated. My question to you now is, who's going to be monitoring if 15 to 20 girls show up to West Straw Park to play lacrosse Wednesday morning at 10:30 for COVID-19? Who's going to make sure there's social distancing? All right. Our soccer coaches, like I said, I'm a girls soccer coach. They have sign-up times. Only so many girls are allowed to show up each time. They're put in groups of 10 and they're put in different parts of the field. Right now, I could have 30 to 50 girls show up to West Straw City Park tomorrow, and there's no one there watching them. They could be playing live scrimmages, and I have no clue what's going to happen. I'm also curious, has anyone contacted the fall and winter coaches of 833 to let them know that this is a possibility that, hey, come August 15th, there's a likelihood that we may not be playing soccer, football, volleyball, and your contract's going to get cut to a third because maybe those coaches right now won't be putting in the efforts they are. I know our girls soccer coaches have doubled their time frames. They normally do like an hour workout on Tuesdays or whatever the day is. They're now doing 2 separate ones to create more time to keep less players in the field at the same time. This might be something the district's going to look at if they're going to continue this practice of doing that. I think I will save the rest of my comments for the rebuttal time. Thank you.
I just want to be clear that there's not that'd be called a rebuttal. There's not a rebuttal time, but you can use it for your closing argument if you'd like to make a closing argument.
I'll just keep going then. I'm sorry. Mr. Witherspoon stated we have 43 head coaches. I don't know. My numbers say I think that there's 9 spring sports with 3 high schools. That comes around 27. I'm just curious where that came from. And that was the only other thing I had. Oh, I'm sorry. It was mentioned by the district that it's impossible for us to coach in the spring season. As I also teach math at Park High School, I would argue that I have a closer relationship than my 50 lacrosse players that I do to I teach an advisory that I get 30 minutes every 2 weeks with 22 kids in a class. The chance of me to be able to make a connection in 30 minutes every other week, that's a total of 18 times. It's compared to me working year round with 50 girls who, if they're having issues during this time, I think I would be a much better asset in that part of my job. I know the Rosemont, I spoke with their coach, their head coach when they went into this COVID thing. They were the first people that the district asked, can you please reach out to your athletes to make sure they have food, that they have access to the schoolwork? Is everything okay at your home? Like I said, as a teacher, I had to do that for my 22 advisory students. But I don't know those parents as I'm making those phone calls or those students as well as I do my 50 athletes. I would think that we could have used us as coaches to make those contacts and make sure that our kids are taken care of. Because I can tell you stories. These are the kids that invite us to weddings when they get older. They give us the baby announcements. All right. We can make sure that these kids are safe and they reach out to us. That's all I have for right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
right, since we're in the, thanks, Scott, by the way, for representing our coaches. You did a great job. I know we've been asked not to duplicate a lot of the information, so I will do my best to mark down what Scott had already covered, because I think he did an exceptional job on doing so. A couple of the questions I had that maybe Dr. Witherspoon can answer at some point, or maybe the school board should get information on prior to ruling on this. I know we furloughed on his account 200 employees. I'm wondering, of those 200, how many applied for unemployment benefits that were granted not only state unemployment benefits, but in addition to that, the $600 from the federal government on a weekly basis? Because none of the coaches are eligible for that, because this is a second job. All of your cafeteria, support services in that area, and many of the bus drivers, this is their only job. They were all granted unemployment benefits as long as this wasn't their secondary job. So they were made whole. And not only were they made whole, many of them were paid over and above what they had gotten or would have gotten by working for the district. We talk about the public purpose doctrine, and that was cited on a number of occasions for both your legal and from Dr. Witherspoon. My question to the board would be then, the district didn't supply busing for all the students within the district. With that same thought process of public purpose doctrine, are the school board planning on refunding that money to the taxpayers that wasn't spent on busing? Because I'm assuming that the school district would then make a decision based upon the fact that those buses weren't used, those employees weren't paid, the gas wasn't supplied for those buses, and there should be a plethora of money that wasn't spent due to COVID-19 on other things that the district had. Granted, there was other things that the district chose to do that weren't required legally to do, but they chose to do because it was the right thing, and I agree with them. And some of those things cost money, including feeding some of the children within the community that rely on the district to provide that. And I think that's a great thing. But we have to also understand that if we're going to say that the public purpose doctrine is to not pay for things that we did not get, one could argue that distance learning wasn't the same as regular learning, but yet the teachers were all compensated at 100%. Many districts that paid their coaches use distance coaching. My son is in a club team with lacrosse, as is Dr. Jacobus' son, who plays club lacrosse. I think he can attest that if he got a bill for club lacrosse, he continued to pay that and receive distant coaching. There was no dollar amount given back due to distant coaching. And what Mr. Leonard said in regards to the contact with the students, I think it was a little short of what really we do. I've been at least contacted 2 or 3 times from the school asking me to make contact with my players because they weren't logging in. They weren't getting in touch with their teachers, and they were struggling through the distance learning. I met with those students, personally met with those students. I've had many students that have had troubling times during this COVID-19 pandemic that I met with to ensure that they were safe, to ensure that they got what was important. And I am not a teacher. And I find it probably one of the best assets of a coach is to teach these kids life lessons as they move through life. And I will agree with Mr. Leonard. I've been to a number of weddings. My entire coaching staff, with the exception of my JV head coach, were all my players. Every one of them played for me. Now they coach with me. They're giving back to their community. These are the things that you want the district to do. These are the things that you would expect for the coaches to do. Not only have they come back and coach with me in my line of work. I've hired a number of them at the city. So the things that we do as coaches as important as teaching in some of these kids' arena, and sometimes we have more contact on a daily basis than the teacher does. Mr. Leonard talked about the time that we spend. January 1st, captain's practices start in the AM. Every morning, 3 or 4 days a week, they practice for captain's practices in the morning. In order to use a school facility, a volunteer needs to be there. However, the volunteer has to have had a background check, and what we are told is a coach should be available. And did you lose me, or am I still here? Okay, something just happened on my screen. So we ran captain's practices with us sitting in the stands, my coaching staff and myself, 3 or 4 days a week since January. So January, February, and March, until such time as the other spring sports started. So baseball then took precedence over us in the activity center. So we had been already coaching, and I won't say coaching because we're not allowed to actually coach, but we have to monitor them. We send them everything that they need, and we get them ready so they can prepare themselves for the season. Coaching is a 12-month out of the year. Just to give you an example for coaching, the school district for boys lacrosse does not provide helmets, does not provide balls, provides uniforms at a 1/4% every 4 years. So our budget for our booster club that I meet with on a regular basis, pretty much year long, is over $13,000 that they need to raise funds for or bill the students in addition to. And with the logic to the district of me just walking in, it would cost probably $700 per player just to play lacrosse with what the district gives for us to have for equipment. So to not coach year round, you're essentially saying boys lacrosse wouldn't exist because the cost would be too high. There wouldn't be enough students. So that's my big thing is the teachers sure figured out a way to do online. I think the coaches could have done it online. Matter of fact, we did for the most part, even though it was not required. And that's what we chose to do. So legally, you are completely allowed to go by the contracts by law. Legally, you can follow those. I don't think it's the right thing to do. I don't think that's the message that you want to send. On the front of the South Washington County District site, it says Igniting Passion. By me receiving a letter in the mail in no personal contact from anyone from the district that my job was terminated other than a letter does nothing but extinguishes the passion. It is counterintuitive to what you have on your website. It's not right. If we would have had the opportunity to literally be heard and talked to and spoken about and allowed us to all meet with Zoom, we probably could have hashed this all out. But this was the only remedy that we were allowed through the letters that we received. And I don't know how any of you would feel on the board, but if that's the only correspondence you got for your job that you had a lot of passion for was a termination letter, I think you'd feel the same as we do. And I think this is your opportunity now to make it right. To say, we made a mistake here, we should have done this differently, and how can we make this better? That's all I have for my presentation. I really do appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, talk to us, and go over these things. And I have faith that you'll make the.
All right, thank you. So we got knocked off, so we're back. Oh, wait, is Mick? Oh, Mick is
Here.
there. Okay. Okay. All right. So where do we go from here, Mick? Sorry.
Well, I'd like to just offer a few quick rebuttal points and then ask if Dr. Witherspoon or Dr. Jacobus has anything they want to add before we wrap up and put it into your capable hands. There was quite a bit of conversation about things that we do in the summer, things that we don't do in the summer, things that we do outside of season. And some of that really raises concerns for me, to be honest with you, because I think there's a misunderstanding of what is permitted and what's not, frankly. And I'm going to read directly from the Minnesota State High School League rules to you. And this is something for us to look into as a district as a whole to see if our coaches are actually doing this, because if they are, it's problematic. Because the rules say very directly that you cannot coach members of your team outside the season except during the summer waiver period. And it goes on to say, and I'm going to read it, quote, verbatim. So you know what? It's not Mick. It's the State High School League that's saying this. Quote, there is no such thing as summer waiver practices. Remember, the summer waiver gives your coach permission to have coaching access to his or her students. It is not a school function. It is not a school team, and your school has no responsibility. Your coach is an independent contractor, not acting in his or her official capacity as a high school representing the school. And if they're doing something different, that is a problem. And one that would raise certainly quite a bit of concern for me. It goes on to state, and I'm going to read again very directly, during the school year prior to and following the sports season and outside of the approved summer coaching waiver period, coaches may not provide coaching, instruction, training to any member of their team, including B squad, JV, or varsity, other than during the actual season or under the summer waiver. So this notion that they're paid to do stuff year round, I certainly hope that's not happening. I understand the domains and how, somebody could interpret that in multiple ways. But when we look at the domains and understand them for what they are, implementing effective off-season training program, and even the list of from the job duties or the job description, what we're talking about there is the same thing that the State High School League says you can do. Create a voluntary program if kids want to do it. And we expect our coaches to do that. That's part of the preparation for the season, part of what happens during the season. And one of the reasons why we paid the coaches a third of their stipend to address that preparation, which we know that they do. And again, this notion that the season itself is worth less than 2/3 of the coaching contract certainly raises concerns for me. Many times it was asked, why would other schools not terminate their head coaches? And the premise of this statement is false. Many other schools did. Some paid less than you guys did. Some paid the same. Some paid more. Some paid 100%. Many did not seek legal advice on the issue at all. And we're not even thinking about the public purpose doctrine of the gift law. And I know that because of conversations I've heard and had after the fact with people who thought, oh, we didn't even think about that until it was too late. This notion of you've saved all this money for busing, I won't speak to that. If Dr. Jacobus wants to, during the COVID-19 pandemic, districts were required to continue those payments. And some employees did get paid despite not doing work. And the reason for that is it was specifically required under the executive orders, whereas coaches weren't addressed under the executive orders. There's some question about when they can start doing stuff. The letters they received specifically in Exhibit 6 and 7 say they may return to their position in subsequent seasons. And if that's some clarification they'd like, I would just encourage the coaches who are obviously very heartfelt in their positions here to just reach out to Dr. Witherspoon or Dr. Jacobus and have that conversation with them so that they can get some clarity on the situation. The coaches are suggesting that they might not put in the effort if they knew they wouldn't get paid, or maybe they wouldn't have in the past. Like Dr. Jacobus, I've coached myself. I've coached cross country, I've coached track, and I've coached soccer. And I got to tell you, the notion that you're going to do that for the money, if you're doing it for the money, you're doing it for the wrong reason. Nobody who has a passion for something does that for the money. The $4,000 that coaches receive, The Department of Labor says they're essentially considered to be volunteers under the law because it doesn't even come close to compensating. That's what the U.S. Department of Labor says for the hours that any good coach puts in. And that's so true. No coach who has passion does it for the money. And I know these guys aren't doing that either. That's not their point. I understand their point, but I just want to be clear. Nobody who's good is doing it for the money. I thought I heard someone say they personally met with students. If they did, that's a problem. Monitoring captain's practices, if that's what's happening, is a problem. A separate issue we need to look at because that shouldn't be happening. And then finally, this issue of no communications from the district. I recognize that this is a very complicated time, and I'm sure the board does too, where laws were changing on almost a daily basis with new executive orders. And I know staff have been working unbelievable hours, including administrators. But I'm also aware that Dr. Jacobus did speak to at least one of the coaches and have some communication with them. And if there's anything else that Dr. Jacobus, you or Dr. Witherspoon would like to respond to that was said, I'd encourage you to take that opportunity now. Otherwise, I'll turn my microphone off and simply would again encourage the board to adopt the findings, conclusions, and decision that was out there. There are significant financial ramifications from not doing things, particularly for a district in your financial position. There are also legal ramifications for that. And I would be concerned about, as I said in my opening, about a decision to upend the administration's decision here to terminate the contracts mid-season and to reduce the payment pro rata. Thank you. Dr. Jacobus and Dr. Witherspoon, would you like to add anything?
I would. One, I don't know what communication athletic directors had or activities directors had with coaches. We started this conversation long before the high school league canceled the season because we knew it could be a possibility. So the information was out there because I was having correspondence with people who had heard that there may not be payment for this season. And so I'm not sure, and that's something I think those are good questions that were raised on that communication. I have to look into what did the activities directors communicate and talk about it as well. This is really difficult. As I said in the letters, it's not a value judgment. I had said too, I went into administration because I wanted to be an athletic director because I got to go to college with athletics. I believe it's really important. As I mentioned, I was a coach. I think Scott is right. It's been a while since I coached, but I do have 3 kids. 2 of them were 3-sport athletes, and 1 was a 2-sport athlete. And my kids my 3-sport athletes were in Minnesota, and I know what kind of contact they've had in the summer, which wasn't other than the 2-week camp period. None of that is matters because I know the amount of time that coaches spend, and I think it's such an important aspect of high schools. But I'm in a very difficult position when we look at our budget. This is the end of my 8th year here. My very first year when I started, we were cutting $4 million. Since then, we've tried to cut $10 million, and we've had to add back because it's so difficult when you're cutting programs for kids. Every program that we have, we believe, is important. And so now we're going into another budget reduction process, a huge budget reduction process of $10 million. A few years ago, we tried to cut $8 million. We only got to 4. So we continue the deficit spending. We've gone out for 3 levy elections since I've been the superintendent. And every time that we talk to parents, they are adamant and frustrated with us and say, why can't you live within your means? We have to live within our budget. Why can't you? Every time you come to us, you say, well, costs have overrun expenses and our expenses overran our revenues and we're asking for more. Whenever we try to live within our budget, then we get pushback and it's very difficult. So I am really struggling with this coming across to coaches and to people as being non-caring and you guys need to just work outside what we pay you and that's just the way it goes. It's not that. I did have to look at those furloughed people and the good point on different aspects that the folks had options for them, but none of them wanted to take that option. They wanted to stay at work. And now next year, when we look at $10 million, that's all that is that we have left our people. And so we're going to be reducing a lot of staff members come in the fall. The money that we had with the third, there's a piece of the amount of work that goes into planning and things like that. But I still believe that when you think about the number of hours that you put in during the season, each day to practice, if you're at an all-day tournament on the weekend, then you're analyzing what happened so you get ready for practice next week. I still see the bulk of our work being done during the season. And if you're a 2-sport coach or a 3-sport coach, how can you do 75% of your work outside of the season with 3 different sports or 2 different sports? So I don't mean
Anybody else lose them or? Okay.
I lost him as well. Let's wait and see if he can come back online.
Yeah, I don't see him either.
I've texted Bob. He's on his way down.
I think we're back on. I just got knocked out. If we change the decision, then we will look at a $10,250,000 reduction next year. And so that was the difficulty that I was in. And I'm sorry, I wish we weren't in that situation. So I'll stop there. Yeah, we're back.
Dr. Witherspoon, is there anything you'd like to add?
The only thing I'd like to add is I just wanted to thank both Scott and Greg for your comments and perspectives tonight. And then specifically, Greg, if I would welcome some personal discussion about communication and learn more about it and find out how we can improve as well. So I would welcome that conversation. So thank you.
This is a very hard situation. You don't have people who have done bad things. You know, you've got 2 coaches who obviously care much about their kids, and nobody's disputing that. It's a tough financial situation that your district is facing. And then there are some legal hurdles that you have as well. So I think with that concludes our presentation, unless Dr. Chkobus, there's anything you wanted to add, and we'll put it to the board's hands to you can ask each of the coaches if they'd like to make a closing statement. And then, again, we'll put it back to you to vote on whether you want to adopt proposed findings and conclusions or modify them or whatever decision that you feel is appropriate.
Excuse me, Mick, is there a point in this where the board can also ask questions?
It should be unnecessary, but board members could ask questions. If you have something you think is significant, I think you should feel free to ask that.
Is this the appropriate time?
It can be, yes.
Okay, I am curious, the coaches mentioned some virtual coaching. I would like to hear more about what was done for virtual coaching.
And I want to speak to that first, just to be clear in saying that virtual coaching was meant to only allow for the connections with the students. The State High School League said very clearly, if you look at Exhibit 2, it's simply connecting. You're not allowed to actually do any coaching. So the phrase virtual coaching is not actually correct. It was a virtual connection to check in with kids is what the State High School League said was permitted, and anything beyond that was not to be permitted. And then the activities director in emails that I do have repeatedly stated, as the coaches have acknowledged, that it was meant to be optional if they wanted to reach out and talk to their kids. Is there more to that you'd like to hear from individuals about?
Can I add to that? So it was mainly connections, but we were also allowed to provide individual workout skills. So one of my assistant coaches recorded videos. So a girl could go in her backyard and do one stick skills by herself, or if she had her mom and dad who would throw a ball to her, she could catch and do skills like that. So we did that for a time.
And I'd like to also piggyback on that, where it says the coaches may in Exhibit 2, board members connect with participants via electronic communications. And number 2 is provide optional individual workouts or individual skills training via electronic communications. Connect with and support participants we're challenged with the times of COVID-19, conduct virtual end-of-season activities, provide optional individual workouts were done extensively, sending out videos like Mr. Leonard said. In addition to that, there was other videos that we did find and send out on a regular basis. We did skills challenge, push-up challenge, sit-up challenge, other things to keep them encouraged to move forward and get through this extraordinary times that we're all having. In addition to that, we did a drive-through for all my seniors. This is what, you know, the stipend is one thing, but my seniors, they didn't get an opportunity to play their senior year. And I think Dr. Jacobus' son is a senior at White Bear Lake High School, who we would have played against this year. I feel bad, but we made every effort. You know, we went up when the stadium light was on and did 6 feet in passing. We had public safety come up. We had a nice parade, as did Scott, for all the seniors. So the coaches may do. We did. We didn't have to. We knew after April 28th, we didn't know if we were getting paid. Remember, the district, if you look at your notes, May 11th, we were given the information that we weren't getting paid. May 11th. This was April 28th. We got it from then. So what happened between April 28th and May 11th? We were following these. Yes, they're optional, but any coach, any person that has anything to do with athletics is going to do the right thing for their players.
The other question I have is, I'm not sure who to direct it to, maybe Kevin. Because I know the 1/3 contract, I took a look at some of the exhibits, and Mr. Renzel's contract has a lot of dates on it. And so the season is dated March 23rd to June 13th. He signed it March 25th, and it's stamped coming in, I'm assuming it's stamped when it comes back, April 2nd. So we were already in distance learning at that time. And then the April, so already, I'm just thinking in terms of fundamental fairness, I think. So then April 23rd is when the state canceled the athletic season, spring athletic season, and that's about 4 weeks in, which is about 1/3. But if we look at the date of the termination being 5/11, that's about 7 weeks in. So that'd be like 7/12. So I'm wondering if originally that 1/3 was calculated on that 4/23. It seems to me more reasonable, if that's what the calculation was, that it would go from that start date to when the actual termination was. So I don't know if that's a question for Kevin or who that goes to.
I can speak to that in a couple of parts. I do have a series of the emails, and I just on the fly here, I'm not going to be able to pull them up from Mr. Kimmel, but for example, from other ADs in the district, I'm aware that the updates were going out on a regular basis to the coaches as early as early April. You know, I'm looking at one email, April 16th, notifying coaches that HR will be making a decision about coaches' pay. So that everyone is aware that that was an issue that was sitting out there. And then after the distance learning period began, coaches again weren't to be providing coaching. The only thing they were supposed to and legally could be permitted to do was connect with people and provide optional workouts, which was sending things out, but they weren't being permitted to do coaching work. So they should not have been getting paid for coaching work. And beyond that, I'll let that to Mr. Witherspoon or Dr. Jacobus to address beyond that, because I wasn't part of those discussions, but I am just looking at emails generally. And again, the ones I have in front of me happen to be from Mr. Wooten, but I'm aware that there were numerous emails going back and forth about the possibility of coaches not being paid. So they were aware of that much earlier in the process when the formal notice came out.
And what I'd say about, Louise, you were talking about the season. Once school was closed in March, then there was no coaching happening. We couldn't be with kids because everyone was home and we got into the distance learning. So that stopped anything. Then the league was talking about, would we have a potential season in June? And so even though we knew they were trying to make a decision, we didn't want to say we're not paying or stopping payment because payments come in as the contracts come in, they start being paid on each cycle for the pay periods. And we didn't want to say things if we said no and stopped, and then the league said, oh, by the way, now the Department of Health says we can have something, and then we have a league later in the year, maybe even in June or July. And so we're waiting for them. So we're having discussions that this is a concern. And as I said before, I'm not sure what athletic directors or activities directors were talking with coaches, but that information was out there. And then finally the league came out on the 28th to say no season. And so then we started to look at where we could not determine how many hours people put in because every coach is different. So we couldn't decide on that 1/3 based on, we think every coach put in 27 hours up to this point. What we looked at is where were we with the start of the season? Where were we with paying contracts up to that point? And that third was where we were as we were starting into the season, even after the closure because of the COVID closure. And so it wasn't based on what we thought exactly hours were, because that's different between every coach. You hear the many things that were done with Greg and Scott, but other coaches may not have done that. So we can't determine exactly. So we try to look at where we are with our payments and about where that was as we got into the season to look at that third. And quite frankly, I felt that was a fair amount that we had been into because, again, services weren't rendered. So when you talk about frustration in our contract, if a contract can't be completed because the services weren't rendered, then the payment wouldn't have happened. And so, again, that sounds cold, and I don't mean to do that. As I mentioned before, we are in such financial straits. We're looking at every cent we can save. And so as we looked at this, we felt like where we were with that 1/3 into that piece was more than fair since we didn't have a season. But again, you hear that there's a lot of things that happen. We could not determine that every coach put in so many hours. So it wasn't based on a mathematical calculation. And Kevin, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
If I could ask one question relative to that, if we're in a kind of a loose meeting type. My question to you is, was the athletic directors or activities directors consulted in regards to the 1/3 payment? And why wasn't there an opportunity to do a Zoom meeting with the coaches and say, we're in financial straits, this is how much money we have, and allow the coaches to help you determine how much each person should be paid? Because I will tell you as a head coach that the amount of work I do during the off season is different than my assistant coaches. So the assistant coach is getting 1/3. Well, I thought it was gracious. Truly, they didn't do 1/3 worth of their work because they do all of their work during the season, very little during the off season. It's really the head coaches. And had the district had the opportunity to engage their coaches or their activities directors to ask for guidance in that, we maybe wouldn't be here today. So I guess my question is, was there any conversations with the activity directors as relative to the pay? And I think, moving forward, you've got a lot of experts that can help you make these decisions. I'm in an executive type role, but I lean on my people that are the experts in those subject matters to help formulate my decision to come up with the best outcome for everyone involved.
We had discussions with the athletic directors. Mike Johnson oversees them. They were ongoing. It wasn't ongoing with me. We didn't come back and say how much. We didn't have discussions about pay because, one, we don't have a funding stream. We didn't have the money to pay. And the 1/3 was more than, we felt like it was very fair with where we were. And so we didn't feel like that there was a concern about, is that amount fair or not? Truly, without a season, no pay would have been fair as well, because again, a lot of the things that were said, that's not what should or could happen based on the league. It's not what we expect. were paid during the season. And so that wasn't a consideration as far as getting with a bunch or having a Zoom call and asking people's opinion on what they felt. We really don't have the funds. So even that third that we paid, the 86,000, just adds to that 10,000 or $10 million that we have to reduce next year.
Hey, this is Simi. I had a question, and this may be a question for Kevin or Keith. It's just I just want to understand, what are the consequences of, the contracts that we saw were from March 23rd to June 13th. And we heard the coaches say that they spend a substantial amount of time outside of those dates doing coaching related work. What are the consequences, or are there restrictions on setting up a different way to structure the compensation so that it's not just that 3-month period that would, and this may be just a question for future, for the future as opposed to for now. But I'm just trying to understand if there are any limitations on how we should be thinking about how compensation works.
I can tell you,
Well,
Simi, this is Nick Waldsberger. Go ahead.
Again,
that-
there isn't. Go ahead, Mick. I've talked enough.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to talk over Dr. Jacobus. I was just going to say that this is the way it is done across the state, and for significant reasons. I mean, many coaches coach more than one sport, and as Dr. Jacobus noted, saying that you're paid for year-round, it doesn't make any sense when you're looking at multi-sport issues. Additionally, in terms of just labor law and the way these contracts are viewed, it's meant to be a relatively defined period of time, and the state high school league prohibits, coaching activities outside that period of time. So if we start getting into wordsmithing and saying, well, they're really doing coaching outside of that, your district is going to be in trouble. Your district's going to be in violation of a number of laws. And so that would be an unwise course of action to take. As a matter of practice, our coaches preparing and good coaches staying connected, yeah, we expect them to stay connected. And even to provide voluntary workouts for kids to do, absolutely. That's what good coaches do. But that's not what they're paid to do. They're paid for the season itself. And as I said at the outset, if you start saying you're really paid for 12 months, then when you get that coach who quits right before the start of the season, these guys only worked a week, some coaches didn't work at all, then you're going to be paying them the full amount, even though they didn't coach at all a day in the season. So there are a number of problems with it, and I would strongly advise the board not to go down that road, because aside from the state high school league, which will be all over us, we're going to have other issues as well.
And Simi, it's Kevin. If I can add too, there's a lot of moving parts here when it comes to the compensation piece. So one thing we have learned from COVID-19 here is that we can tighten up some of our structures we use for how and when we pay our coaches. And so we are coming up with a plan with input from activities directors on how that might look and work.
Thank you.
We can't coach in the summer. Many of the head coaches, and I don't want to talk for Greg or Scott, but they coach club teams and they coach other teams, or they run camps that kids pay for to go to, because we can't do the typical coaching. So it's got to be paid for the season, and then not trying to figure out what happens outside, because we're not supposed to have that other than a small period in the summer.
All right, so if I am understanding this right, then each of the coaches could have a short closing argument. So is there something in addition that you wanted to, or?
Yep. And all should be limited to under 5 minutes. I'll waive the right to make a closing argument at this point and just rely on the proposed findings and conclusions, because I think we've exhausted all of the viewpoints on the opposite sides, but I'll leave it to the coaches if they want to collectively have 5 minutes to respond to the board.
I can go first here. I just wanted to respond one thing, or a couple things. It made it sound as if we're the only two coaches. I don't know if it meant to come off this way, but it felt like we were being shamed for making the hearing. Like we're the only two that did this. We must be the greedy coaches. I just want you to know, Greg and I are two of the more senior coaches at Park. Coaches are reaching out to us. Hey, how's it going? What's going on with this? And I've also been working with coaches at Eastridge and Woodbury, baseball coaches, track coaches. We're all feeling this. It's not just us two. It felt like it when that was brought up. And Dr. Jacobus said, how can you, if you're a multi-sport coach, how can you put in 75% of your time in the off season? I can't. I'm a two-sport coach, but I assist in soccer. I'm a head coach in lacrosse. I couldn't do it. My soccer duties are limited pretty close to just the season. I have like 2 coaches meetings I attend with our head coaches, and I have a few camps. We do 1 camp in the summertime. But that's all I do for soccer. You're right. I can't do that. I believe we only have 1 head coach at Park who's a head coach of 2 sports, and he co-head coaches the golf team. Talked about I want to make sure you're clear. We only coach physically our players on the field in the summer waiver period out of season. It starts June 15th through August 7th. So that's about 2.5 months that we coach our players. But we still have other things that we have to do. We have the scheduling, ordering, that have to get done beforehand. We have to meet with our booster clubs year round. We meet with the parents. All right. Our parents count on a banquet at the end of the year. They want team bonding. They want overnight trips. They want team dinners. The players want this. I know this is what happens. So it's not just actual physical coaching. We don't break the rules going out of season. We have, as far as Greg was talking about, that January through March, there has to be a district employee inside the activity center. We're not coaching our players. We have to make sure nothing happens to the facility for that open lacrosse time. We're there making sure that some kid doesn't hurt another kid during that time. As far as my closing statement, Mick's right. I don't do this for the $4,000 that my contract is. I'm a Park graduate in 1991. Very proud of that. My first 5 years teaching, I taught out in Las Vegas. And in 2001, I excuse me, get choked up. I moved home and I had job offers at Roseville High School, and what is now Lakeville North High School is just Lakeville High School back then, and at Oltman Middle School. And I chose 833. Feels like home. My kids go to school here. But it gets frustrating as a teacher and a coach when I look at the other 15 schools that I compete against and I don't get treated like they get treated. And when it comes to my teaching contract, it seems like we're one of the last districts to sign our contracts. And our superintendent's one of the first ones. He signs his contract so much before we do. It's tough. And my older daughter talked about going into education. And I love my job. And I love working with my students and my athletes. But I've discouraged her from going into the field. My son, I think right now, is leaning towards education. And I tell him, I go, Jake, the job's changed a lot. And at times I get very frustrated, like I said. I look around, like I said, I have friends in other districts, and this keeps coming back. Like I said, teaching contract and coaching. It's not about the money. It's the respect. I don't feel the value. at this time. I'm going to leave at my time right now. Thank you.
Scott, thank you. I just want to also reiterate, not only do I coach here, I work here. I was 89, so I was a little bit older than Scott, even though I'm obviously better looking. and he has more hair. But Park is a very special place to me, obviously to Scott. And when the district makes decisions, they really do affect the morale. And when I talked about the igniting passion is your goal, this does the opposite. When you don't treat your coaches the same as everybody else in our conference. Everybody else in our conference. The entire SEC conference pay their coaches in full. Wasn't one, it wasn't two, it was the entire conference. And I think all I'm looking for is parity. When you talk about an HR, Dr. Witherspoon, I think I've been a part of a few contract negotiations. You look for parity within peer communities, and you look for fairness. We're not the richest communities. However, I don't think we're the poorest communities either. And I don't think our district is doing that and didn't do it this time by creating parity. They should have engaged us, should have engaged the athletic directors to get the opinion as to how much to pay the coaches should be paid or what would be fair. And they should have had a meeting with us. None of that happened. The contract is the contract. Neither Scott nor I will look at Mick and say you don't have the legal authority to do so. But just because you can doesn't mean you should. Period. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. You should provide parity and ensure people are being treated like everybody else is being treated in the area. I would ask that you hold your vote for tonight and that you have an opportunity to personally speak to the athletic directors or the activities directors to get their opinions. I know there's a lot of moving pieces. I understand that. I've been a part of this district and I've lived in this district for over 49 years. My mom has lived in their same house for 57 years. I've raised 4 children, 3 of which have graduated, 1 of which is going to be a senior in the high school. I know that there's financial issues, but if every other school in this conference made the commitment to their coaching, and we are the only district that did not, that does not bode well for this district. And to be very honest with you, my parents of the Booster Club were embarrassed that we're being treated differently than everybody else. And personally, I don't want to be embarrassed. It's not about the money. Mick, I'll agree with you 100% on that. Dr. Jacobus, I know it's not about the money. I'd do it for free. I started Park Lacrosse for the boys who didn't have a program over a decade ago. There was no program. The boys in this program, in this school, in this community, signed petitions to start a program. I started the lacrosse program in the school, not only that, in the city, 16 years ago. Blood, sweat, and tears to make this program what it is. I've had a number of students go off and play NCAA and get scholarships based upon this. That doesn't happen by being a half-ass coach. It just doesn't. It's not about the $4,000, it's about the kids. I'm not asking for anything special. I'm asking for what everybody else gets. That is it. To be honest with you, the money means very little. Because I probably donate more of it than I actually get in. That's not the issue. The issue is parity. The issue is fairness. The issue is being treated like everybody else. I think everyone on the board would agree that if nothing else, we're going to teach our students, if we're going to teach our community anything, it's to be fair and impartial and treat everyone with kindness. I do not feel like that happened today. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Again, I will recap again that Legally, you are 100%. Mick is right. Mick's a good attorney. Felt like you did an excellent job. He represented you well. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Thank you.
This is Louise. I have another question. I think it's for Mick. I'd like to know what the ramifications are of this vote in terms of, are we talking about 2 coaches, or does this go into play for all our coaches? Are we talking about it's a yes or no, or are there some options in between?
Well, you could limit it to these 2 coaches, but if you do that, you're going to have an uprising, obviously, and that would seem, in terms of fairness, to be contrary to everything, and particularly when decisions were made. The problem is this whole thing unravels quickly because decisions were made based on fairness to the other 200 plus employees who were furloughed and all the other people who got hurt from COVID-19, and we're trying to do everything we can. And so at the end of the day, while we might say it's parity and fairness and all that, you're being asked to pay for work that wasn't done. That's at the end of the day. Now, can you do something different? You need to issue findings, conclusions, and a decision. Can you alter what I gave you? That's within the purview of the board. Can you go and personally interview IDs? No, you can't. That would violate your roles and responsibilities as board members, and you know that from previous trainings you've attended. Again, that's a management decision in your policy governance. So can you change the findings? You can. Can you change the decision? You can. That's within this board's purview to do that. It's just the implications of doing it would be very widespread, in my opinion, because you've got not only the other coaches, and you heard the number that I mentioned, the $172,000 number, but then you have directors of programs and advisors, and they're all going to be saying, why just these 2 guys and none of us? And then you're going to have a whole other list of people saying, well, how about us? And why should they be paid for? And there might be people in the community who say, and particularly with these 2 gentlemen, they're great guys. I'm sure they're loved in the community. I'm sure they're loved by families. And people might say, absolutely, you should pay them. But you also might have another 50% of your community saying, you're paying these folks a third for a canceled season, and you're going to pay them more than that for a canceled season for work that they didn't do. And that's another big part of your constituency you have too. So I don't believe you value people by paying them for a season that was canceled. I feel saddened by the fact that these 2 obviously good coaches felt like they didn't get the communication that they wanted or the shake. And I know there are a bazillion moving parts and people were working 24/7. I know what admin is, but that doesn't change the bottom line of the implications of paying them and having to put $175,000 out or whatever the number is for others, and then paying the directors and the advisors too. And are you going to cut another $225,000 to pay these coaches? That's what it comes down to, in my mind.
I guess my struggle is in 2 places. One is the day that we terminated the contracts was May 11th, and that's longer than 1/3 into the season based on what their contract says. I also struggle in the findings with number 9 talks about, although coaches may choose to perform tasks outside the season to strengthen their programs and their connection with the community, they do so voluntarily, when we're seeing that in the job description. And we're seeing signs of that. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, finish.
No, that was kind of, it's just, I don't see those 2 things going together very well.
On the May 11 date, just because that's when the formal notice went out, doesn't mean that they were performing the regular coaching services to that date. And that's a very important distinction to understand. As soon as the distance learning went into effect, school closure happened, they weren't providing those coaching services anymore, the regular coaching services. They may have had some connections or communications via online platforms. Different coaches did different levels of that, but certainly coaching wasn't happening after that. And so again, the fact that the district tried to wait with the hope that there might be a season, with the hope that we'd have a justification for paying them, shouldn't be held against the district in this particular case. Again, they weren't doing the work after the distance learning period went into effect, after the closure period went into effect. And that the job description, I think the job description should be changed, not so much for what's actually happening, but just for clarification for these folks and also for the State High School League. Because I think that clearly we expect coaches to be connecting with people outside the season. There's no question about that. Anyone who's coached knows that. You feel that pressure. Every sport does that. But that doesn't change the fact that they have a season and they're only allowed to quote unquote coach during the season. The things that happen outside that season, that's part of that passion you have for what you do, part of those connections you make with kids, with family members, with the community, et cetera, to kind of build support for your program. But again, that's not part of what you're quote unquote paid for technically, and nor could it be as a coach without violating State High School League rules. And I think the coaches spoke to that really aptly. I think that Mr. Leonard in particular really addressed that. And that I think that that's just truthful. I mean, you just can't be coaching outside of those periods. And I was glad to hear some of the clarification from him that wasn't happening, because we would have serious issues if it was.
Melinda, I have a question. Are the head coaches required in their job description to be setting up that busing and that schedules and everything before their season?
I don't believe that it speaks to that. I have the job description in front of me, and it lists 16 things, and I'll just read it from what the coaches provided. Provide technical expertise in instructing athletes in fundamental skills, strategy, and physical training necessary to realize a degree of individual and team success. Follow district policies, administrative procedures. Number 3, adhere to State High School League rules. 4, promote a favorable image of the district. Encourage community partnerships that enhance district programs and services. 5, work with the athletic director to evaluate program needs, supplies, and equipment. 6, develop and coordinate off-season activities. 7, organize team tryouts while maintaining integrity of the selection process. 8, review procedures, game schedules, and develop a practice schedule before the start of the season. So that's that preparation work that we paid for in this particular case. 9, recruit, train, and supervise student managers and trainers. 10, provide guidance, communicate high expectations, and show an active interest in student progress. Promote academic success as an important priority for all students. 11, maintain high standards and uphold student conduct expectations. Report student discipline issues to athletic director. 12, identify and verify students who have fulfilled requirements for letters, awards, and certifications and participate in student recognition programs. 13, assign and keep track of athletic equipment issued to students and staff. 14, work closely with the Booster Association. 15, participate in staff meetings, training, and professional growth opportunities as requested. And 16, it says other duties as assigned. And that's the full list.
Melinda, I see that as the activities directors. I was a little surprised that all the scheduling and busing was asked by coaches to do. Now, when I was an athletic director, many times the coaches wanted to contact different coaches and make sure they could schedule, but that really should be in the activities director's realm of responsibility. That's surprising. I have to follow up on that one.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have assistant.
Yeah, that's just real quick. It's Greg. Just to clarify, I'm sorry I'm interrupting here. I apologize. No, we are expressly doing all the game scheduling for non-conference. We need to arrange that in advance. And I'll give you an example. When I was a new coach, I got hired late because the season the park had just started a program. I didn't know I had to schedule games. I had 8 games that year out of the 12 at that time because I didn't know. And then every year after that, I'm literally, even though I've been terminated, I'm still trying to get games for next year already. Because if you don't get the games in advance and you don't get the buses in advance, and maybe Dr. Jacobus can talk about this, last year we had a busing shortage. If you didn't have your busing already done, your kids didn't have a transportation. So those are absolutely imperative to have a season. It's not a if. And I'll just say that there is absolutely no way that any activities director would be able to manage that with all the different programs. It has to be the coach. It just, the activities directors are very busy people. I'm not going to knock them at all. They do a lot, and there's no way they could manage all the different activities and game schedules and busing and all of that in addition to. So that's just my 2 cents after a decade of coaching here.
And is it always the head coaches that's taking care of all that, or does the assistant coach help out with that?
In my experience, it's always been the head coach. So you really, and Scott kind of alluded to this, is you have one person that kind of oversees the entire program, meets with the booster clubs. My assistants don't do that. And nor do I expect that of them. A lot of times your assistant coaches are younger people that just came back from college. They really aren't prepared for a head coaching position. So you really do the administrative end of it, and then they would help out with skills and drills and maybe an offense or a defense or something that they learned when they were playing. But the administrative part, and that's why I think that the parity comes in, and you see a lot of districts paid their head coaches a different stipend than their assistant coaches. And it's to memorialize the fact that the head coach's administrative duties, not during the season, far outweighs what the assistant coaches are doing. So.
Thank you.
So Mick, I'm sorry.
Just to back on that, the AD should be doing all the scheduling. We did it all when I was an AD. We sit with the league. We do all that scheduling of the league games, and then we'd always ask the coaches, who do you want to play for your non-league? And we did that. Then there's an assistant that all the athletic directors have. They do all the scheduling for the transportation. So I'm surprised, and I feel bad for what you're telling me that you're expected to do, and I want to follow up on that. But absolutely, that's why the athletic director position was such a busy position. It was scheduling like crazy, transportation, and I want to take a look at that.
Yeah, so I guess, Mick, I just wanted to ask you a question. So where are we in the process? Are we supposed to be asking questions like this? It seems like we're getting off track a little bit in some respects, but I guess I have never been through this process, so I just want to, I guess, check in with you and kind of see where we are and where we should go next. And
Yeah, we really are pretty far afield off track here. I wanted to be respectful to the board members that had questions, though, if they felt like there was information that was necessary to their decision-making process, and so didn't want to cut anybody off. But we have, as far as the way a hearing goes, we typically would have more formality to it than we have tonight. If we've exhausted everything, then I think it's just a matter for the board now to be able to discuss the issue and then make a decision. Proposed findings and conclusions and a decision have been submitted to you. You have that authority to make modifications. You can talk it through. And ultimately, whatever you decide, you'll want to make a motion. Someone will want to make a motion to adopt whatever findings you have and conclusions and decision. Second, and then vote on it. And you'll need to do a roll call vote just because it's a virtual meeting. And then, again, ideally you would have a decision tonight because that's not a meeting that's covered or a hearing that's covered by any statute. But the problem is that memories quickly fade of what was actually said here tonight. And I think you're going to get a less robust and less quality decision the more time that passes. So.
all right, so when we do the deliberation, do you all fall off? Is it just us, or do we all just stay online?
It is a public meeting, so we could all stay online. I'm happy I'm happy to drop off. Don't feel the need to be part of that unless you want me there available for questions. But you're free to discuss it as you want. Again, nobody else may participate any longer once this part of the hearing is done, other than board members. So, including me, unless you invite me or ask me to. Now, Dr. Jacobus can because he is an ex officio member of the board. But it would take an invitation from you to anyone else to be able to participate or speak.
Okay, like I said, I'm not trying to cut anybody off. I just want to kind of understand where we are with everything, because I know we had a 5.0, which obviously is deliberation, and it kind of seemed like with questions, etc., that we were sort of in that deliberation piece in some respects. So I just wanted to touch base with where we are and kind of where we go from here. So,
Yeah.
so I guess I do think we're kind of in the deliberations piece. So, as far as board members, then, were there any other questions? I guess for sure, that you had maybe for Mick as well, but.
I guess this is Simi. This may be a question for Kevin, I guess. One of the concerns that I had listening to all of this was that there seems to be a misalignment between what the stated expectations of the role of the coaches and what is actually in the evaluation. In the evaluation, they are, they've got components of off-season training, booster community media involvement, and the booster stuff is in there. But I'm concerned I'm concerned that we have enshrined non-season job duties as part of the formal evaluation process for the coaches. And I was hoping Kevin could help me understand if I'm missing something, or if there's something that is how this makes sense.
Sure, Simi. I'm sorry, I don't have the job description right in front of me, but I think it's been brought up several times throughout tonight in terms of the expectations that are in the job description, and in terms of some of those things can be planned for outside of the season. I think I lost someone. Plan for outside the season time. I do agree that we can take a look at job descriptions for head coaches. For sure, I definitely think that is a possibility of moving forward.
Simi, were you talking about the job description or the evaluation part on the domains?
The evaluation part, what was it called? The 5 domains of domains. So the component, crap, I didn't write it in my notes. Component 1E, off-season training. And then the communication relations domain 4. And I'm just concerned that we have created, enshrined into some sort of, we've created this expectation that there is work that is expected to be done outside of the period for which they're compensated that's beyond the scope of what we tell them, right? And I think it just maybe came down to, I think it was Scott who basically said if he didn't do these extra things, he wouldn't be able to keep his job. He wouldn't remain as the coach. And so I'm concerned that if work outside of the period for which you're compensated is mandatory, then it should be, then the compensation should cover that, I guess, is how I feel. And so I just want to make sure I feel like I must be missing something.
And I think actually Mick addressed this in an earlier statement that he made. Mick, do you want to address that again, or?
Well, I think there's a couple of pieces here, that the way you interpret it, I think that for example, when you talk about implementing effective off-season strategies, training, that's sort of like what the state high school said you're allowed to do during the distance learning period, where you can provide voluntary workouts, but that's not coaching. That's not what they're paid for. And in addition, and I think that looking at what the Department of Labor says with these positions is it's essentially a volunteer notion outside the season, and even during the season, because they're working so many more hours than what they're getting paid for. And so the Department of Labor said you don't even look at these head coaching positions to determine whether there's a minimum wage hourly rate, because it's expected that there's so much volunteer work that goes with it. But putting that aside, even the express language of the domains, I don't think that means that they're required to. If there's an expectation that's being communicated by ADs, or if there's a lack of clarity on that point, I think that that is a good thing for us to know about and something that should be addressed going forward. And because I don't think it's appropriate for ADs to say, you must do this, you're expected, you won't keep your job, or that it's required. I do think that by and large, effective coaches do it because they realize the value of community engagement, parent engagement, student engagement, support for the program as a whole, booster club engagement. But to say that they are evaluated and shouldn't keep a job based on that, I agree that shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be part of what it is. And I think that's something for, Dr. Witherspoon, Dr. Jacobus to look into to say, what is being conveyed and communicated to people. But again, that doesn't change the fact that they're paid for a season of work, not paid to, because they're not allowed to do coaching outside of that. What they're doing outside of the season is not legally coaching, and it can't be. If it is, we have much bigger problems.
You're not talking about the summer waiver period from June 15th to August 7th, right? Because we can coach. I just want to make sure that's where.
Yeah, you made the point earlier, Scott. Very valid point. The summer waiver period is a separate period of time. It's an exception. But even during that period of time, what the State High School League says, if you look at their Q&A at the bottom of Bylaw 208, is you're acting on your own then. So I just want to be clear about that. During the summer waiver period, that's the language that I read. The summer waiver gives your coach permission to have coaching access. It's not a school function. It's not your school team, and your school has no responsibility. Your coach is an independent contractor, is not acting in his or her official capacity as a high school representative or of the school. So I think that it's really important to make sure that that distinction is understood, and maybe a lot of coaches don't, and maybe that's not conveyed well, I don't know, administratively. Those are the kinds of things that's good feedback for us to have from, boots on the ground coaches about what's actually happening. But that is, I'm reading right from the State High School League Q&A on Bylaw 208, what's permitted and what's not. So I just want to really be careful. And if we find out, and I'm not pointing the finger at you and saying, bad Scott, you or anybody else, but if we find out that systematically we are having people do coaching outside of season, we've got to look at that, because that's only going to hurt everybody in every program.
Okay, I kind of want to try and see if we can get the ball rolling here or move forward a little bit. I feel like we're talking about some things that are outside of this discussion. We're talking about this season that they want to be paid for. We're not really talking about what they did fall. We're talking about this then. And as far as head coaching goes, I see from what they're saying and what the Minnesota Department or Minnesota State High School League has said is basically they can provide workouts, they can provide those types of things. Now, it can't be coaching, but that technically is helping these kids through the season. It's helping them stay fit for the season. It's helping them with those things. I know we're in budget issues. I understand all of that. However, I do feel that head coaches should be paid. As far as assistant coaches, it sounds like they really don't have any responsibilities throughout that. I don't believe they should be. And really, all we are here to talk about is we're not talk about is none of them came forward. We don't know if any of them have issues. We're talking about coaches, strictly coaches here, in my opinion. And I believe the head coaches should be paid for the season. They are able to still send workouts. They have been. And that is my opinion. And I don't know how we go about, if there's an agreement on that, how we go about changing what is currently being asked or what, but that's where I feel at this point. Thank you.
This is Melinda. I guess I feel, to piggyback on what Katie said, going forward, we should come up with a different type of job description and evaluation kind of thing if the expectation is that they should not be doing that work outside of their season. But the fact remains, right now, there is that expectation. It's clearly in their components of effective coaching and in their performance evaluation. Those things are listed in there. So I think that's what we really need to be looking at right now is not what can we change in the future, but what's happened this last spring and how can we compensate them for that. Thank you.
This is Louise. I too see that our coaches are, from my point of view, clearly being asked to do things out of season that they've had done in terms of what is fair payment. I don't know if 100% is fair, but I think 1/3 is nowhere near enough. So I think the minimum I would look at is at least paying through the date that we terminated the contract. I can certainly look at something more than that, but I can't see us doing less than that.
And this is Simi. I have the same concern that if there's an implicit understanding that coaches are supposed to be working, and this has been the understanding for what sounds like several years, my concern is that changing the implicit contract that there's what's written and then there's what's understood. And my concern is that changing what is understood is not fair, not right. And so one of the questions I had, based off what Katie said, she said that she differentiated between the head coaches and the assistant coaches. And so the amount of money that we've been given, approximately 1/3 of paying all of the coaches was $86,000. How does that subdivide between head coaches and assistant coaches if we were to choose to pay head coaches more and keep assistant coaches at what they have received so far? It would be helpful to understand the financial ramifications of that and to help us understand, to Louise's point, what point between 1/3 and 100% would be an appropriate amount of money.
1/3 was that $80,000 number.
Or just the head coaches alone?
Just the head coaches alone, yep. And you could confirm that with Dr. Witherspoon, but that is my understanding, is that was just the head coaches. And that's why we said if you were gonna, when you talk about there are head directors, head band advisors and groups, your number, if you're gonna pay them all 100%, you're roughly $250,000. If you're just gonna pay your head coaches 100%, you're gonna be paying 170, I can't remember if it's $172,000 more was the number. So again, that's the monies that you're going to reallocate, and those are choices for you made, hard choices, because those are teacher positions you will not have in the fall. But those are the board gets to make those hard choices.
Pat, did you have anything you wanted to add? So I just want to make sure if you have anything else. One of the things, I guess, that, when we're going back to the domains and the coaching, certainly we have these expectations, obviously, to have relationships with our students and our parents and our boosters and our communities. And unfortunately, you can't turn relationships off. So, the expectation, I don't know how we're going to fix that piece. It doesn't say in here specifically that you have to do these things outside of the season. It just says you need to do those things, obviously, to strengthen that, the community that you have with your team and your community. And that's just an aside. I guess if we are leaning toward paying more, I guess I would actually go back to the April 23rd where we canceled the season. That's a pretty definitive time frame, and our timing as far as being able to do the additional work, is kind of somewhat based on our meetings and when we can do the votes. But the high school league actually canceled the season, so everybody was more than aware that the season wasn't going to happen for sure as of the 23rd. So I guess I don't know how all this, like you said, as far as the contract, if it's March 23rd through June 15th, whatever March 23rd to April 23rd is, I guess that to me seems like that would be a reasonable piece as far as, paying when we had the final decision that we weren't going to be able to have a season in the spring.
This is Louise. My question there is, by us not terminating contracts until the 11th, we're hanging on to those coaches as opposed to them going elsewhere. I just grabbed a calculator. If we went to the May 11th date, just in general, 7/12, it's an additional $64,500, if that number is important to anyone.
Pat, did you, yeah?
Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now you can hear me, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, I'd be okay with paying them if we hadn't refunded all the students' money, if we kept, a third or whatever. But I think we're being unfair to our taxpayers when we're spending money that we're going to be cutting teachers to pay for this. And I think that although coaching is an admirable position, I really respect coaches and all the time they put in. They deserve more. We can't pay that. And I don't see how we can spend more money on something that we shouldn't be paying in the first place because of the Mick, you said something about a tax. We're not allowed to give a gift. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. The public purpose doctrine and the gift law prohibit you from giving gifts.
Yes.
Now, if you're going to take the position that they're getting paid for work that they did, that's a position you could take. But I'm struggling with that because their work by law, by the State High School League rules, is limited to the State High School League season that they coach for. So you're going down a road. The board is going down a road. I understand the fairness piece and the concerns that have been articulated, but you're heading down a very troublesome road. And I think that it's going to have bigger implications than people are realizing right now.
Yeah.
But again, that's a choice that you're making. And I think you aptly stated, when you're talking about education and teacher salaries and cutting programs, and Dr. Jacobus mentioned cutting $10 million.
Yeah.
That's a choice that this board is making to add $250,000 or whatever it might end up being. I don't know the dates. You'll pick the dates, and that's up to the board.
And to me, $64,000 is one teacher that we're going to cut. So I'm not in favor of giving them any more than 1/3 of what they already received.
Kevin or Keith, what would be the exposure if we were to add in, say we make this decision and then there is we hear from, the speech coach or whoever who has also been terminated, what would that financial exposure look like?
Kevin may know the dollars, but I want to tell you, if we do this, we're doing it for everyone, because I am not going to be in the middle of saying yes to this and that. So it's not just coaches. It's going to be all of our Schedule C and things, because that puts me in a difficult position to justify. And so I don't know, Kevin, if you know the amount. You just have to remember, I think it needs to be all or nothing.
Yeah. So I don't have the specific dollar amounts with me with the other activities, but I would agree with you, Dr. Jacobus, that if we are going to do it, I think we should do it for everyone, if that is the decision that the board makes, because it would be too hard to decipher who gets how much and when and such throughout such a large system. And
then again, it's we have to think about, remember when we get into the next levy, that's what people always are just emotional about, is that you never live within your means. So that's something you have to, this precedence you're setting moves us forward with, because if we're at 1.25 fund balance, we're so close to statutory operating debt, we may have to go out and ask the voters. So I know it's not sounding that it's caring about the employees, but we do have that fiscal responsibility and what we do with taxpayers' funds. And when we keep going and asking for more, and they keep saying, why don't you live within your means? So you just have to think about all of those things that I get stuck having to think about. And when I make people upset and they feel like I don't care about them, it's because I'm trying to look out for the whole district. And I've been through 3 levies and they're not enjoyable. And we're really heading down a tough financial course. So that's a tough one.
This is Greg. I think the 43 is all the Schedule C employees. There's only 9 spring sports. 9 times 3 schools is 27. I don't know how we get to 43 without having all those spring activities included and inclusive of the total dollar amount. Unless I'm off somewhere, my math might not be great, although I do have my PhD from Park High School. Not always perfect.
Greg, you're right. It's Kevin. It does include other people like speech coaches and other advisors.
This is Melinda. Keith, aren't the other coaches like the musicals, bands, speech coaches, and all of them, aren't they getting 2/3 instead of 1/3, or is that misinformation?
It depends on, because many of them there were performances in the fall and in the winter, so they're paid throughout the year. So they were paid with what work they had done. And then so it may be a different percentage. Kevin may know those, but that's why it's different than the 1/3. It wasn't just for a spring piece of their responsibility.
Yep. So it's Kevin. I'll just add to, and I'm sorry, it's cutting out a little bit, but Melinda, to answer your question, all the activities directors, some principals, the assistant soups met to talk about and come up, and the activities directors came up with a game plan based on when activities took place, on whether or not someone should get, 2/3 full, or what that looked like. So I'll give you a good example. Yearbook advisors got full pay because they produced a yearbook.
Yeah.
And worked all year.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yep.
So Kevin, you're saying the activities directors did have input into this whole process?
Yes.
Can I ask if the advisors have the same evaluation type thing? Do they have to go through the same thing that we have to in the job description of?
So I'm sorry. I guess Mick had said we need to do our deliberation now, and I apologize. I do, but I think we need to let us do our talking and our work. And I appreciate everything you said to us and provided us, but I think we have to take this time right now. Like I said, I apologize. I don't mean to be disrespectful.
Mick, do we have to vote on this today? I mean, I think we were given a lot of information, a lot of financial information. I think we need more financial information from Dan to figure out what it looks like if we go to May 11th, what it looks like if we pay just the head coaches, what it looks like if we pay these Schedule C. I think we need, in my opinion, I would like to see more information on what these actual financial ramifications look like than just rough dollars that we're being given right now.
Yeah, as I said earlier, Katie, you're not legally under any statute that would require you to make a decision tonight. So the board has, again, it can put the decision off to a later point in time and direct the administration to provide some additional financial information about that. Board members obviously couldn't communicate about it after, outside the scope of a public meeting, because it is a matter for discussion at a public meeting. And then you'd have to bring it back for consideration at another public meeting and for a vote and determination.
Personally, I would like to see that happen. I think we're just being thrown a lot of information to try and make this kind of decision right now. I don't know if anybody else feels that way.
I'm with you, Katie. I think one of the challenges I have is that, I've sat on CPAC for years, and I am, mildly obsessed with our budget and raising the amount of reserves we have in our general fund. And so, as a consequence, I don't actually want to spend any money, but I also want to make sure I understand when I say yes or no to a decision, that I understand the the real financial implications of what that decision would be, and to see if there is some, I think there are a lot of permutations that we could explore, and it would be helpful to understand the actual financial impact of those permutations, not just, to Katie's point, round numbers or ballpark estimates.
I agree. I'd like to see the numbers written out, like if we did this, it would cost this. If we did this, it would cost that. I think that would be very helpful.
I'd like to see us go to deliberation right now.
That's actually what we're doing right now.
Oh, we're deliberating with the coaches there and everyone else. I mean, are we going to dismiss them or?
By law, they have a right because it's a public.
Okay,
meeting.
all right,
There's not an
so-
opportunity, unless there's you could go into a closed session for attorney-client privileged information with me if you thought that there was specific advice relative to litigation you needed, but otherwise, so really what I'd say is the option is you continue to deliberate till you reach consensus. Someone could vote, could make a motion to table it. Someone could make a motion to adopt the findings and conclusions as written. Someone could make a motion to adopt the findings and conclusions with modifications. But someone will have to make some kind of a motion to move it forward one way or another at this point in time, unless you're going to deliberate more.
I move table this until a later meeting.
I second that.
All right, so we have Katie motioning to table this at this time, and Melinda has seconded it. Is there any discussion?
I would like to say something. I think we have enough information to vote. I think everything is really clear to me that if we pay more, we're going to cut more teachers, and we're in the business of education. And I don't see that as a benefit to our taxpayers who pay this money for education. And we're using education money, not money that we're collecting from student fees, because we already refunded that. So I think we're stuck with what we've already done. And perhaps in the future, if this ever happens again, we don't refund the money. We use it to pay the coaches. But at this point, I think we have to stick with what we're here for. We're here for education of students. And if we have to cut one teacher, that's many classes that have to have more students in them. And as a teacher, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's a good board decision. We're here for education. Okay, so, and I appreciate coaches. I too volunteer for many things, and I know the rewards are not money, it's intrinsic. It makes you feel good to volunteer, and I wouldn't, you can't put a price on that. I mean, it's just a wonderful thing to do, and you're wonderful people for doing it. But fact remains, if we pay them more, we're going to lose a teacher or more. So I'm just really adamant that we vote. That's my opinion.
This is Louise. I have a question, Keith. Do the fees we collect from students fully fund our athletics?
No, we have to fund through the general fund. As was said earlier, though, we don't get a funding stream for that. That's just an expectation that you take care of those things. So that's why we don't have a dedicated funding stream from the state. We just make up the difference. And part of that is we don't want to raise fees enough for it to be self-sustaining, because it would be very expensive for kids to be involved in a sport, and we would price kids out.
Any other comments about, we have the motion on the table right now to table this for another meeting. So if there are no other comments or questions, then we will take a vote. So we're going to vote to table this. That is what the motion is. Saying yes, we'll move it to a future date. Saying no, we'll defeat the motion. So we'll have a roll call vote.
Melinda Doles.
Melinda, you were on mute.
Oh.
Now you're, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Louise Hines.
Yes.
Simi Petnaik.
Yes.
Pat Driscoll.
No.
Sharon Van Leer is absent. Katie Schwartz,
Yes.
Tracy Burnett,
All right, so motion passes. We will gather a bit more information and we will put this as an action item on an upcoming meeting. And thank you all for, it is not an easy thing, of course. We know how much benefit the athletics is to our students, and how much time and energy our coaches put into that, which we very much appreciate. And so there's just so many things, of course, for us to consider. So very much appreciate all of your opinions in our discussion this evening. And so with that, we are at 6.0. We will adjourn for this evening and address this at a future date. So thank you very much.
Madam Chair, may I make a recommendation? I think it would be helpful if the board members would specify for the administration what information they need to provide to the board.
So I know okay.
Do you want me to restate what so basically what it would cost if we pay just head coaches, what it through the date that Louise said, May 11th. So figuring out how many extra days that would be, what it would be to pay through the entire 100%. I guess I'd like to know if the other ones that we're talking about paying, if they actually had some of the direction like the Minnesota State High School League did, where they could send workouts. Because if we're talking about a club that a teacher sits in the classroom and the kids have a club, the teacher is not probably doing anything with those kids outside of once school was canceled. Once distance learning ended, that club ended. So I guess I'd like the information on what we would pay through May 11th, what it would be through paying 100% through the season, and which ones were actually given direction to that they could still have contact with the kids under their care.
So you're talking about the Schedule C in its entirety?
Yes, which ones we're talking about paying that actually were given direction that they could contact the students and give, as they talked about, the distance basically workouts, because that's similar to distance learning. What were they given direction to do? Which ones are given that same direction as the coaches were given?
And to add on to Katie's, I think it would be helpful to understand how many, Schedule C, I think probably encompasses a lot of different employees, both, for example, I'm assuming both the head coaches and the assistant coaches are part of Schedule C in terms of how they're classified. And so it would be helpful to know, for a lot of these activities, are there employees that are equivalent to assistant coaches, and who are, how many employees are equivalent to head coaches, but for speech or band or the musical or whatever?
One of the things I would probably recommend to you is that it's going to be really difficult to decide what we pay to May 11th. If we take a coaching stipend and divide it by the number of days of the season, it's probably going to May 11th, they'll probably be less than a third of that. And so I think you're going to look at, it's probably, that's why we couldn't come up with where are we with that third. We had already got into the pay, so I think you're going to be looking at paying 100% as we go through. We'll figure all this out and show you, but I just want you to know that as Mick had mentioned, in the amount that the stipends cover for the season, hourly and daily, is very small with that many days in a season. So we'll give you a lot of different numbers that we can figure out, but I want you to know it's not as simple as just saying May 11th that there's a definitive amount of money that should have been paid out because of the amount of time that people spend.
The other thing,
So
sorry,
I guess the other,
I wanted to add to mine was that it would also be helpful to understand the implications on our general fund and what the costs are, what the costs would do to how it would affect what we have left in our fund balance. You know, if you know, it's one thing if you know, and it, to the point someone made earlier, other districts are better funded than we are. It would just be helpful to understand what kind of exposure this these various costs leave us with.
Yep. Whatever we have in the fund balance now, that's what we'll have, and we'll add this on to what we'll need to reduce next year to keep that fund balance. So, but yeah, we can get to that.
Keith, this is Melinda. I know both Scott and Greg talked about, you know, they're not, it's more about the principle of the thing. They're not expecting 100% type of thing. They're just more about showing the value. I'm wondering if we could take a look at maybe like what 50% would be, what the numbers would be at that too, instead of just looking at 100%, kind of looking at some different numbers.
so the other, I guess, I think important piece to me somewhat is the ramifications of violating rules. I mean, I don't know if there's any fines or anything we may be subject to, but I guess I would like to understand that a little bit more, as far as the Minnesota State High School information, if there are any, I guess.
Couldn't we talk to those other schools that paid their coaches to find out how they got around that?
I suspect, honestly, they didn't consult legal counsel. I mean, that's the truth of the matter, is sometimes, and they hear about it afterwards and say, oh, you know, they could have tried to justify it by saying we're going to have them do distance coaching. Some districts tried to do that. You know, if they had a healthy fund balance and were able to pay for it, that you can get around the public purpose doctrine by doing things like that. But I don't know of anybody that said we're paying them for other than preparation, which is expected, you know, and even the State High School League recognizes there's preparation activities, but you couldn't say this board should not, under any circumstance, say it's paying for coaching activities outside the coaching season. If you do that, you're going to be forfeiting your coaching, your games, your season going forward, because the State High School League will say if you're paying them for coaching, quote unquote, activities, that's a violation of the rules, and you can't do that.
Well, so I apologize. We were trying to, so do you guys
I think
have?
so. Yeah.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we will now adjourn.
Thank you for the opportunity, everybody.